The weekend that never came back. There are moments in life that feel small while they're happening. A decision made in a hallway, a lie told to avoid an argument, a backpack zipped in a hurry. Moments that seem harmless, until you realize they were the last calm seconds before everything broke. On the evening of October 31st, 2003, two teenagers walked out of a prestigious school in São Paulo carrying bags that looked heavier than normal, not because of what was inside them, but because of what they represented. Freedom, secrecy, first love. They were smiling, nervous, excited. They had no idea that within days, their names would be spoken across the entire country. Not as students, not as dreamers, not as kids in love, but as victims of one of the most disturbing crimes Brazil had ever witnessed. This is not a story about monsters hiding in the shadows. It's a story about how ordinary choices can cross paths with extraordinary evil, and how sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. It just waits. Liana was 16 years old. People described her as vibrant, the kind of teenager who filled a room without trying. She came from a comfortable family, attended one of the most respected schools in the city, and had plans that stretched far beyond her age. She talked about the future with certainty. College, travel, experiences, life. Felipe was 19, more reserved, thoughtful, a scholarship student at the same school, balancing studies with work. He carried responsibility early, but around Liana, something softened. Friends noticed it. Teachers noticed it. That gentle, almost shy happiness that only first love can bring. They had been dating for just a short time, barely 2 months, and like so many young couples before them, they wanted time alone. Time without supervision, without explanations, without rules. So they planned a trip. Nothing extravagant. Just a weekend camping in the countryside, nature, quiet. A few days pretending the world was smaller than it really is. There was only one problem. Neither of them believed their parents would allow it, so they lied. Liana told her father she was traveling with friends from her community. Felipe avoided details altogether. These weren't lies told with malice. They were the kind teenagers convince themselves are temporary, harmless, necessary. Just a weekend, they thought. What could go wrong? That night they didn't go home. Instead, they slept under the concrete, the structure of one of São Paulo's most famous landmarks. A strange choice, maybe, but for them, it felt like freedom, an in-between space, no longer children, not quite adults. At dawn, while the city was still quiet, they boarded public transport carrying their backpacks and a tent. By mid-morning, they were far from the noise, heading toward a rural region surrounded by trees, dirt roads, and scattered houses. The place had a reputation, beautiful, isolated, and neglected. What they didn't know, what no one had warned them clearly enough about, was that isolation cuts both ways. It offers peace, and it removes protection. As they walked through the area looking for a place to set up camp, people noticed them. They didn't blend in. Their clothes were cleaner, their speech different, their presence unfamiliar. And Liana especially drew attention without realizing it. Not because she tried to, but because she stood out. Some eyes followed them longer than they should have. 2 of those eyes belonged to a boy who was only 16 years old, but already known in the region for violence, impulsivity, and fearlessness. His nickname was Champinha. Champinha had grown up fast and wrong. By his mid-teens, he was already feared by adults, drinking, fighting, carrying weapons, crossing lines that most people never approach in a lifetime. Authorities knew his name, locals avoided him, trouble followed wherever he went. And that afternoon, as he watched the couple pass by, something shifted. This wasn't just opportunity, it was fixation. Later, with older companions, alcohol in their systems and boredom heavy in the air, a plan began to form. At first, it sounded like a robbery, an easy target. outsiders with no protection, but plans born in that environment don't stay simple for long. As the sun went down and the forest grew darker, Liana and Felipe settled into their tent, unaware that they had already been noticed, discussed, and chosen. The night was quiet, too quiet. And then, without warning, the fabric of their safety was torn open. What followed over the next few days would shock investigators, traumatize families, and ignite a national debate that still hasn't ended. But in this first part of the story, it's important to pause, to remember who they were before headlines erased their faces and replaced them with tragedy. They were not symbols, they were not lessons, they were not statistics. They were two teenagers who believed a weekend could belong to them, and they paid a price no one should ever pay for wanting to feel free. Part 2. When the night turned against them. There's a moment in every tragedy when instinct tries to speak, a sound that doesn't belong, a movement that feels wrong, a silence that arrives too suddenly. For Liana and Felipe, that moment came after nightfall. The forest around them had gone completely dark. No city lights, no distant traffic, just the quiet rhythm of insects and the faint movement of leaves responding to the wind. Inside the tent, they whispered about small things, school, music, the future. The kind of conversations that feel safe simply because they exist. They didn't hear footsteps at first. They felt them, a shift in the ground, a pressure nearby. And then, without warning, the thin fabric of the tent was ripped open, not slowly, not cautiously, violently. A blade tore through the material as if the barrier had never mattered at all. Before either of them could react, a weapon was pointed inside. Voices, unfamiliar, aggressive, confident. Orders barked in a tone that left no room for negotiation. Get out, don't scream. Do exactly what we say. Panic is not dramatic, it's paralyzing. Their bodies froze before their minds could even understand what was happening. Felipe moved first, instinctively positioning himself closer to Liana, trying to shield her without knowing how. It was a reflex, not a strategy, and it made no difference. Their heads were covered, their vision taken away, hands shaking as they were forced to walk, guided by people who knew the terrain far better than they did. Every step felt longer than the last. Every sound echoed too loudly in their ears. They were led to a small, isolated structure hidden deeper in the area. A place that should never have existed. A place that offered no safety, no witnesses, no escape. That's when the truth began to surface. This wasn't just a robbery. It never had been. Inside the shack, the rules changed. The couple was separated almost immediately. That moment, the last time Liana and Felipe saw each other face to face, passed without ceremony. No dramatic goodbye, no final words spoken out loud, just a look. A look that said everything words couldn't. Fear, confusion, and a silent promise neither of them knew how to keep. Felipe was taken away first. Liana was left behind, surrounded by people whose intentions were becoming painfully clear. The hours that followed blurred into something unreal. Time stopped behaving normally. Night stretched endlessly, punctuated by fear, exhaustion, and shock so deep it numbed her ability to react. This is where many stories become sensational. This one doesn't need to. What happened to Liana during those hours wasn't chaos. It was control, deliberate, systematic, cruel. She wasn't seen as a person. She was treated as an object, something owned, something taken. Her resistance was not weakness, it was survival. Meanwhile, not far away, Felipe was alone. He didn't know what was happening to her. He only knew they had been separated, and that the people holding him were no longer pretending money was the goal. At some point, the discussion around him shifted. The tone changed. Voices lowered. Decisions were made without him present. He was no longer useful. And in the minds of the men controlling the situation, that meant only one thing. The next morning, they were taken into the forest again. The walk was different this time, quieter, more deliberate. Felipe was ordered to move ahead. Liana was kept behind, guarded closely. The distance between them grew with each step until the trees swallowed him from view. She heard the sound before she understood it. A loud, sharp noise that didn't belong in the forest. Then silence. When she asked what had happened, she was lied to. They told her Felipe had been released, that he was free, that he was safe. And for a brief, fragile moment, she believed them. Because believing was easier than facing what her instincts were already screaming. Felipe never walked out of that forest. Over the next days, Liana remained captive. Her sense of time dissolved. Day and night blurred into a continuous state of fear and exhaustion. She was moved, watched, controlled. Promises were made and broken repeatedly. "You'll be released tomorrow. We just need to wait. You'll go home." Each lie was delivered with calm confidence, the kind that almost convinces you to hope. Outside that small, cruel world, something else was happening. Her absence had been noticed. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were never delivered. Excuses stopped making sense. Her father felt it first, that deep physical intuition that something was wrong. What began as worry quickly turned into panic. Police were notified. Searches began. Photos circulated. Helicopters flew low over the area. Volunteers joined in. The case exploded into national attention almost overnight. The forest that had once hidden everything was now being watched, and the person holding Liana knew it. Fear began to replace arrogance. The plan was unraveling. And when control starts to slip, people like Champinha don't look for solutions. They look for endings. Chapter 3, Part 3. The moment hope ran out. Hope doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes. It cracks quietly, piece by piece, until one day you realize you're holding on to nothing, but your body hasn't accepted it yet. For days, Liana lived inside that slow erosion. She listened for sounds that never came. She waited for promises that were never kept. She watched the faces around her, searching for something human. Some sign that this nightmare could still end differently. Outside the forest, the world was finally paying attention. Her face was everywhere. Television screens, newspapers, flyers dropped from helicopters. Her name echoed through police radios and family prayers. Entire teams combed the area. Neighbors whispered, reporters speculated, and inside that small, filthy shack, the person holding her felt the pressure closing in. Champinha was no longer confident. He was afraid. Fear does something dangerous to people who are already violent. It doesn't soften them, it sharpens them. It convinces them that escape is impossible, and that eliminating evidence is the only way forward. By then, Liana had begun to sense it too. The tone had changed. The lies felt thinner, the movements more restless. On the morning of November 5th, 2003, Champinha told her something she had heard before, but this time he said it differently. "You're going home." He told her they would walk to the bus station together, that she would be released, that everything was over. Hope surged back, just enough to hurt, because when someone has taken everything from you, even the smallest possibility of freedom feels enormous. They walked into the forest together, no guards, no shack, just trees and dirt paths. This should have been the moment the story turned. It wasn't. What happened next was not chaos. It was a decision. A deliberate, irreversible choice made by someone who had already crossed every line there was to cross. Liana never made it to the road. Her life ended there, hidden by vegetation, far from help, far from her family, far from the future she had been planning just days before. She was 16 years old, and when Champinha walked away from that place, he believed the story would end with him. He was wrong. The truth doesn't stay buried forever. Back in the city, pressure intensified. investigators followed leads that all pointed to the same name, a boy everyone in the region already feared. Witnesses came forward. One man, intoxicated and unstable, was taken to a police station and began talking. The story unraveled quickly after that. Champinha was located at a relative's home. When confronted, he didn't panic. He didn't cry. He didn't deny everything. At first, he admitted to Felipe's death casually, as if describing something ordinary. He claimed Liana was still alive, that someone else had her, that she would be found. But investigators didn't stop pushing, and eventually the mask slipped. He revealed where her body was. When police reached the site, there was no longer any hope to preserve, only confirmation. The country stopped. 2 teenagers, a weekend trip, an ending no one could accept. Liana's father collapsed when he received the news. Felipe's family was left trying to process how a young man with dreams of law enforcement had been taken so senselessly. Funerals followed, cameras rolled, questions exploded. How could this happen? How could someone so young do something so cruel? And most importantly, what would justice look like? The adults involved were arrested, tried, and sentenced to decades in prison. Champinha was 16, and that single fact would change everything. Under Brazilian law, he could not be tried as an adult. He was classified not as a criminal, but as a minor who committed an infraction. The maximum time he could be held, 3 years. The nation erupted. Protests, debates, anger, fear. Parents looked at their children differently. Lawmakers argued on television. The word Champinha became synonymous with impunity. But behind the outrage, something else was happening quietly. Psychiatrists were evaluating him, and what they found would prevent his release, not through punishment, but through something far more controversial. A boy the law couldn't hold. When people talk about justice, they usually imagine a courtroom, a judge, a sentence, a clear ending. But sometimes justice has no language for what it's facing, and that's exactly what happened next. Champinha was 16 years old when he was taken into custody. Under Brazilian law, that single detail outweighed everything else: the cruelty, the planning, the number of lives destroyed. Legally, he was not a criminal. He was a minor who had committed acts equivalent to crimes. The maximum punishment allowed: 3 years of confinement in a juvenile facility, nothing more. For a country watching in disbelief, that number felt like an insult. People filled the streets, talk shows exploded, politicians gave speeches that went nowhere. Parents demanded answers that the legal system didn't have. How can someone who did this walk free? How can age matter more than actions? What happens when the law is too small for the crime? But behind closed doors, something else was unfolding. Something that would change the outcome, not through punishment, but through diagnosis. Champinha was sent to a juvenile detention center. At first glance, it looked like procedure, but the professionals assigned to evaluate him noticed something immediately. He wasn't afraid. He didn't show regret. He didn't show confusion. He didn't show emotional fluctuation. He spoke about what happened the way someone might talk about a movie they'd watched. Detached, calm, sometimes even proud. Psychiatrists spent hours with him. They asked about childhood, about emotions, about empathy, about fear. What they found was alarming. Champinha displayed traits consistent with severe antisocial personality disturbance, an absence of remorse, a lack of emotional connection to others, aggression without impulse loss, manipulation, cold calculation. In simpler terms, he understood exactly what he had done, and he didn't care. Even more disturbing reports indicated that he posed a continuing risk, not someday, but immediately. The problem was this: the law didn't know what to do with someone like that. Juvenile detention had a time limit. Prison wasn't allowed. Release would place him back into society with no supervision. So the justice system did something unprecedented. They found a way around the rules, not to punish him, but to contain him. As the end of his 3-year confinement approached, a legal maneuver took place. Champinha was declared civilly unfit to live freely in society due to extreme dangerousness. Instead of being released, he was transferred to a special psychiatric unit under constant guard. Not a prison, not a hospital, something in between. A place designed for people the system considers too dangerous to release, but too legally complex to imprison. This decision sparked another wave of outrage. Some called it necessary protection, others called it an illegal life sentence disguised as treatment. Human rights organizations protested, lawyers filed appeals, judges reviewed evaluations again and again, but every psychiatric report reached the same conclusion: the risk had not diminished. And so Champinha remained confined year after year, long past the age he would have been released, not as punishment, but as prevention. Meanwhile, the families lived with something no legal decision could touch. Felipe's dreams ended at 19. Liana's future stopped at 16. No appeal, no review, no extension. Their lives were over forever. And while the country debated the rights of someone who had taken those lives, their families learned to live with absence, the quiet kind that never leaves. The case became more than a crime. It became a symbol of a legal system unprepared for extreme violence committed by minors. A symbol of a society forced to ask whether age should outweigh accountability. A symbol of fear, not just of crime, but of failure. Years passed. Champinha grew older inside the unit. He attempted escape. He showed continued aggression. He remained unchanged. Each new evaluation reaffirmed what the first had warned. Release would not mean rehabilitation. It would mean risk. And so, to this day, he remains confined. A man who never went to prison, but never returned to freedom either. Suspended between categories, between definitions, between justice and fear. A country forced to look at itself. Some crimes end when the trial is over. This one didn't. It lingered in courtrooms, in living rooms, in schools, in the quiet fears parents carried but didn't know how to name. The name Champinha stopped being just a nickname. It became shorthand for impunity, for legal failure, for a question no one wanted to answer directly. What happens when someone is young but irreversibly dangerous? In the months following the case, Brazil entered one of its most intense public debates in decades. Television programs turned into battlegrounds. Lawyers, psychologists, politicians, and activists argued endlessly, often talking past one another. Social media, still young at the time, amplified outrage faster than facts. And at the center of it all was a single number, 18. The legal age of criminal responsibility. Many people demanded it be lowered. They argued that Champinha knew exactly what he was doing, that he planned, that he controlled others, that he wasn't confused or impulsive. How can the law say this isn't a crime? How can 3 years equal 2 lives? Others pushed back. They warned against building laws from trauma, against reacting emotionally, against opening doors that could never be closed again. If we change the law for one case, they asked, how many children will we condemn in the future? There were no easy answers, and maybe that was the most terrifying part. Behind the debates, the reality was colder. Lowering the age wouldn't have changed what happened to Liana or Felipe. Changing the law wouldn't bring anyone back. And even if Champinha had been tried as an adult, the violence would still exist. The question wasn't just about punishment, it was about prevention, about recognizing danger early, about intervention before escalation, about a system that failed long before the crime ever occurred, because Champinha didn't become violent overnight. His past was filled with warning signs, aggression, substance use, previous attacks, complete disregard for boundaries. He was known, feared, avoided, but not stopped. And when society ignores early signals, the consequences don't arrive quietly. They arrive violently. For Liana's father, the debates never mattered as much as one simple truth. His daughter never came home. He spoke publicly many times, not fueled by hatred, but by grief sharpened into clarity. He didn't call for revenge. He called for responsibility, not just legal responsibility, moral responsibility. He asked parents to listen more, to talk more, to build trust instead of fear. Because the lie Liana told, the one that allowed her to leave that weekend, haunted him. Not because it was unforgivable, but because it was human. Teenagers lie when they feel unheard. They hide when they fear refusal. They take risks because danger still feels abstract. Predators understand that. Years passed. The case stopped dominating headlines, but it never disappeared. It resurfaced every time a violent crime involved a minor. Every time someone said, "But he's only 16. Champinha aged behind locked doors, not rehabilitated, not forgiven, not released. Psychiatric evaluations continued. The conclusions remained the same. No empathy, no remorse, no reduction in risk. And so he stayed where he was, a permanent reminder of a system improvising solutions for problems it never anticipated. Some call it justice, some call it injustice. But everyone agrees on one thing. This case changed Brazil. It changed how parents think about freedom, how lawmakers talk about age, how society understands evil, not as something mythical or rare, but as something that can exist quietly next door. The empty space where empathy should be. Most people want to believe evil looks obvious, that it announces itself, that it comes with warning labels, that it's easy to recognize and easier to avoid. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. Sometimes the most dangerous thing about a person is not what they feel, but what they don't. Empathy is not taught like math. It's not memorized, it's not forced. It forms slowly through connection, boundaries, consequences, and care. And when it doesn't form at all, the absence leaves a hollow space, one that can never be filled later. That hollow space sat at the center of this case. Psychiatrists who evaluated Champinha were not searching for excuses. They weren't looking to soften what he did. They were trying to understand why someone so young could display such control, cruelty, and emotional detachment. Without confusion or panic, what they found was chilling in its consistency. He didn't dissociate. He didn't repress. He didn't deny. He remembered details clearly. He described events calmly. He reacted emotionally only when discussing himself. Other people existed to him as objects, not lives. This is not something that develops suddenly. It grows quietly, often unnoticed, especially in environments where violence, neglect, and instability are normalized, when boundaries are never enforced, when harm has no consequence, when fear becomes familiar. Over time, something breaks, or never forms at all. The uncomfortable truth is this. There were chances to intervene long before Liana and Felipe ever met Champinha. There were warnings, there were incidents, there were patterns, but systems don't respond well to patterns, only to explosions. And by the time this case exploded, it was already too late. That doesn't mean the outcome was inevitable. It means prevention failed. And prevention is never dramatic enough to make headlines. For families watching this story unfold, fear didn't come from the forest. It came from realization. The realization that danger doesn't always look like a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it looks like a troubled teenager everyone already knows and avoids. Parents began questioning assumptions. Would I notice the signs? Would I act in time? Would anyone help if I did? Those questions linger longer than outrage ever does. There's a reason this case still unsettles people decades later. Not because of its brutality alone, but because it exposed something deeply unsettling. The law can punish behavior, but it struggles to address capacity. capacity for harm, capacity for change, capacity for empathy. When harm has no consequence, when fear becomes familiar, over time something breaks, or never forms at all. The uncomfortable truth is this: there were chances to intervene long before Liana and Felipe ever met Champinha. There were warnings, there were incidents, there were patterns, but systems don't respond well to patterns, only to explosions. And by the time this case exploded, it was already too late. That doesn't mean the outcome was inevitable. It means prevention failed. And prevention is never dramatic enough to make headlines. For families watching this story unfold, fear didn't come from the forest. It came from realization. The realization that danger doesn't always look like a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it looks like a troubled teenager everyone already knows and avoids. Parents began questioning assumptions. Would I notice the signs? Would I act in time? Would anyone help if I did? Those questions linger longer than outrage ever does. There's a reason this case still unsettles people decades later. Not because of its brutality alone, but because it exposed something deeply unsettling. The law can punish behavior, but it struggles to address capacity. Capacity for harm, capacity for change, capacity for empathy. Champinha was not released because the system feared punishment wouldn't stop him. He was not rehabilitated because nothing suggested he could be. And so the state did the only thing it knew how to do. It isolated him, not as revenge, but as containment. Yet even containment raises ethical questions. How long can someone be held without a sentence? When does protection become perpetual punishment? Who decides when someone is safe enough? These questions don't have clean answers, and they shouldn't. Because once answers become easy, mistakes follow. For Liana and Felipe's families, these debates exist in a different universe. No evaluation changes the outcome. No policy discussion softens absence. No legal nuance replaces a voice at the dinner table. What remains is memory. And the hope, fragile but necessary, that remembering prevents repetition. The lives interrupted. There's a cruel illusion that tragedy ends at the crime scene. That once the facts are known, once the names are spoken, once the verdicts are delivered, the story somehow closes. It doesn't. For the families left behind, the story fractures, and every fragment becomes permanent. Liana's room stayed the same for a long time. Her clothes, her books, small objects that suddenly felt unbearable to touch. Her father would later say that grief doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in quietly, changing the shape of everyday life. Mornings become heavier, silence grows sharper, time splits into two eras, before and after, before the trip, after the call. If this story made you feel any discomfort, don't ignore it. Leave a like now. It helps this video reach more people. Subscribe to the channel because there are stories that must not be forgotten. And watch the next video appearing on your screen. Silence protects those who do wrong. Information protects those who have no voice.